There's a peculiar thing that happens when you truly see through the illusion, even for just a moment. It's not like acquiring knowledge in the ordinary sense, not like learning a fact or mastering a skill. It's more like suddenly realizing you've been wearing colored glasses your entire life, and for one crystalline instant, you take them off. And here's the strange part. Even when you put those glasses back on, which you almost certainly will, you can never quite forget what you saw without them. The world doesn't look the same anymore. You don't look the same anymore. Something fundamental has shifted in the architecture of your experience, and there's absolutely no going back to the innocent ignorance you once inhabited so comfortably. Now, most people spend their entire lives moving through a kind of waking dream, a consensus trance where they've agreed, along with everyone else, that certain arbitrary patterns and symbols are ultimately real and important. They chase after things called success, security, status. They build elaborate fortifications around something they call myself, and spend enormous amounts of energy defending this fortress from an imagined army of threats. They live perpetually in time, always leaning forward into the future or reaching backward into the past, never quite arriving at the only moment that ever actually exists. And this is fine, you understand. There's nothing wrong with it. It's the game that consciousness plays with itself, the cosmic drama, the divine hide and seek, where God pretends to be separate beings who have forgotten their true nature. But sometimes, through meditation, through psychedelics, through spontaneous mystical experience, through suffering that cracks open the shell of the ego, or simply through a sudden shift in attention, sometimes the veil parts, and you see it. You see that you are not a separate fragment of consciousness trapped inside a bag of skin, desperately trying to survive in a hostile universe. You see that the experiencer and the experienced are one seamless process, that what you call I is not a thing, but a happening, a verb disguised as a noun. You see that you are not in the universe. You are the universe, experiencing itself from this particular angle, this unique perspective that will never occur again in exactly this way. It's important to understand that this isn't just a nice idea or a comforting philosophy. When it hits you, really hits you, it's more real than anything you've ever experienced. It's like waking up from a dream and realizing that everything you thought was solid and separate was actually fluid and interconnected. The boundaries you spent your whole life defending suddenly reveal themselves as arbitrary lines drawn in water. The future you were so anxious about and the past you were so haunted by both dissolve into the eternal now, which is the only place anything has ever happened or will ever happen. And here's where it gets interesting, where the real transformation begins. Because you might think that having such an insight would be permanently liberating, that once you've seen through the illusion, you'd simply remain in that state of awakened clarity forever. But consciousness doesn't work that way. The ego is incredibly resilient, incredibly clever. It will take even the most profound spiritual experience and turn it into another possession, another achievement, another way of feeling separate and special. I had an enlightenment experience. I saw through the illusion. I am more awake than you. And just like that, the very experience that was supposed to dissolve the ego becomes another brick in its wall. So you find yourself in this strange position. You've had this moment, maybe it lasted seconds, maybe hours, maybe days, where the fundamental nature of reality became transparently obvious. And then, inevitably, gradually, or suddenly, you seem to fall back into the ordinary state of consciousness. The separate self reasserts itself. The world becomes solid and external again. You get caught up in your thoughts, your plans, your worries, your desires. The bills still need to be paid. The relationships still need attention. The body still gets hungry and tired. Life, in all its mundane complexity, continues. But something has changed. There's a ghost in the machine now, a persistent whisper that reminds you, even in your most distracted moments, that what you're experiencing as ultimate reality is actually a kind of theatre, a magnificent performance that you're simultaneously watching and creating. You can't quite believe in your problems the way you used to. You can't take your own drama quite as seriously. There's a part of you that's always watching now, always aware that the person you think you are is a character being played rather than the player. This is where many people get into trouble. They think something has gone wrong. They think they've lost the experience, that they've failed somehow, that they need to get back to that elevated state. And so they start chasing it. They meditate more intensely. They read more spiritual books. They go to more retreats. They try different techniques and practices and teachers, all in an effort to recapture what they had. But this is missing the point entirely. The very act of seeking to return to the experience is what prevents it from being present. It's like trying to catch your own shadow. The faster you run toward it, the faster it moves away from you. Because here's what that moment of true awareness actually reveals. There is no separate you who can have or not have an experience of awakening. The whole idea of a person who sometimes gets it and sometimes doesn't get it is part of the illusion. What you truly are, this vast, aware emptiness in which all experience arises, is always already present. It never comes and goes. It's the constant background, the screen on which all the movies of your life are projected. The awakened state isn't something you achieve and then maintain. It's the recognition of what you've always been, obscured only by the belief that you're something else. But this recognition, once it's occurred even briefly, plants a seed that can never be unplanted. It introduces a kind of cognitive dissonance into your experience. On one hand, you continue to function as a person with a name, a history, preferences, opinions, and all the rest of it. On the other hand, you know, somewhere deep in your being, in a way that goes beyond intellectual understanding, that this person is a provisional construction, a useful fiction, not the ultimate truth of what you are. And these two perspectives don't reconcile neatly. They create a kind of tension, a creative friction that actually becomes the engine of ongoing transformation. You see, the point isn't to permanently remain in some exalted state of consciousness. That would be just as much of an imbalance as being completely lost in the illusion. The point is to live in the world fully, to embrace the dance of form, to play the game with complete commitment, while simultaneously never forgetting that it is a game, that the forms are empty, that the dancer and the dance are one. This is what the Zen masters mean when they talk about enlightenment being the same as ordinary consciousness, except about 2 inches off the ground. You're doing all the same things, eating, sleeping, working, relating, but the quality of it has changed. There's a lightness to it, a playfulness, an absence of the desperate grasping and clinging that characterizes unawakened life. And once you've tasted this, even for a moment, you can't fully return to the old way of being. Oh, you'll try. Your conditioning is strong, and the momentum of a lifetime of identification with the ego doesn't just disappear because you've had one insight. You'll find yourself getting caught up in dramas, taking things personally, forgetting the larger context. But now there's always this little voice in the back of your mind, this awareness watching the awareness, that says, "Ah, there you go again. Look at you, totally identified with this story, completely convinced that this passing state of affairs is ultimately important." And in that recognition, in that simple noting of what's happening, there's already a stepping back, already a return to the witness perspective. This is why the ancient traditions speak of awakening not as a single event, but as a process, a gradual ripening. That first glimpse, that initial breakthrough, it's crucial, it's transformative, but it's also just the beginning. It's like opening a door and seeing a vast landscape beyond. But seeing the landscape and fully exploring it, embodying it, living from it consistently, that takes time. That takes patience. That takes a willingness to keep returning, again and again, to the simplicity of this present moment, this breath, this sensation, this thought arising and passing in the space of awareness. What you discover as you continue is that the inability to go back isn't a loss, it's a liberation. At first, it might feel destabilizing. The old certainties have been shaken, the familiar identity has been called into question, and there's a sense of groundlessness that can be quite uncomfortable. You're living in 2 worlds at once, straddling the absolute and the relative, and it can feel like you don't fully belong in either. The people around you who are still completely identified with their ego stories seem to be living in a different universe, concerned with things that now strike you as somewhat absurd. But you can't quite claim to be enlightened either, because you still get angry, still feel anxious, still have preferences and aversions. But gradually, if you don't resist this liminal state, if you allow yourself to marinate in the uncertainty, something shifts. You begin to realize that this betwixt and between space is actually where the real work happens, where consciousness is evolving. You're no longer bound by the conventional worldview, but you haven't escaped into some transcendent realm either. You're here, fully human, fully engaged with life in all its messy complexity, but with an expanded context, a wider lens through which to view it all. You're learning to dance between the absolute truth, that all of this is one seamless happening, that separation is an illusion, that nothing ultimately matters because nothing is ever really at stake, and the relative truth that within the drama of manifestation, compassion matters, kindness matters, how you show up matters. This integration is perhaps the real fruit of awakening, more valuable even than the initial glimpse itself, because the glimpse shows you what's true, but the integration teaches you how to live from that truth. And living from it is a constantly renewing challenge, a moment-to-moment choice to remember what you are while simultaneously honoring the game of being a particular someone in a particular situation. It's not about being detached or indifferent. It's about being fully present and engaged while holding everything lightly, with humor, with perspective, with the recognition that all of this arising and passing show is none other than the play of consciousness delighting in its own creativity. The return to ordinary consciousness after a moment of profound awakening has a quality of bittersweet nostalgia mixed with something you might call useful disillusionment. You remember how simple everything seemed in that expanded state, how obvious and self-evident the unity of all things appeared, how effortlessly you rested in pure being. And now here you are again, seemingly separate, seemingly trapped in time, seemingly burdened by all the concerns and complications that characterize human existence. The mind immediately wants to make a problem out of this. It says, "I've lost something precious. I need to get it back. What did I do wrong? Why can't I maintain that state?" But this very formulation reveals a misunderstanding. You see, consciousness is not a ladder that you climb, reaching progressively higher rungs of realization that you must then struggle to maintain. That model comes from our achievement-oriented culture, which measures everything in terms of progress, attainment, winning, and losing. We've been so conditioned to think in these terms that we automatically apply them to spiritual experience, turning the pathless path into just another career, complete with advancement goals and performance anxiety. But the nature of what we're discussing here doesn't fit that framework at all. It's more like learning to see one of those optical illusions, the images that can be perceived in two different ways. Once you've seen both perspectives, you can't unsee them. You can focus on one or the other, but the capacity to shift between them remains. What that moment of true awareness actually does is introduce flexibility into a system that had become rigid. Before the awakening, you were locked into one way of experiencing reality, as a separate subject confronting an objective world. This wasn't a choice. It was simply how experience organized itself, so automatically and consistently that you never questioned it. It was like being a fish in water. The medium was so pervasive that it was invisible. But once you've experienced the collapse of subject-object duality, even briefly, you've proven to yourself that consciousness can organize itself differently. The tyranny of the single perspective has been broken, and this is irreversible. You can forget it for hours, days, even months. You can get so absorbed in your daily life, in your projects and relationships and problems, that the memory of that expanded state becomes vague and dreamlike. But it's still there, encoded in your being at a level deeper than thought. It's like the knowledge of how to ride a bicycle. Once learned, it may lie dormant, but it never truly disappears. Some chance encounter, some moment of stillness, some flash of beauty or terror, and suddenly you're back in that space of recognition, seeing through the game again, remembering what you forgot you knew. This creates a kind of dialectic in your inner life. There's the consciousness that's identified with being a person, with your name, your story, your goals, your fears. And there's the consciousness that knows itself as the field in which the person appears, the witness that watches the whole show without being caught in it. Before awakening, there was only the first consciousness, and it believed its own story completely. After awakening, both are present, and they're in constant conversation. The person wants to take everything seriously, to grasp at pleasure and push away pain, to secure its existence and prove its worth. The witness sees all of this with compassionate amusement, recognizing it as the innocent play of consciousness, exploring what it's like to be apparently limited, apparently separate, apparently vulnerable. Now, in many spiritual traditions, there's an emphasis on identifying exclusively with the witness, on disidentifying from the person completely. And there's a certain stage in the process where this makes sense, where you need to establish yourself as something other than the conditioned personality that's been running your life. You need to get some distance, some perspective, to break the spell of total identification. But if you remain at this stage, if you try to live perpetually as the witness while rejecting the person, you end up with a different kind of imbalance. You become spiritually bypassed, using awareness as a way to avoid fully feeling and engaging with the human experience, floating above life rather than diving into it. The real maturation happens when the distinction between witness and person begins to dissolve in a new way. Not the dissolution that happens in the initial awakening, where subject and object merge into undifferentiated awareness, but a higher order integration where you realize that the witness and the person are both expressions of the same creative consciousness. The person is not an obstacle to awakening. The person is awakening, consciousness knowing itself through the particular flavor and filter of this unique body-mind. The thoughts, feelings, sensations, perceptions that make up the personal self are not something other than awareness. They're the content that awareness is taking, the form through which the formless manifests. This understanding changes everything. Instead of trying to transcend the personal dimension, you inhabit it fully, but with a completely different quality. You stop resisting what arises. You stop judging your experience as spiritual or unspiritual, awakened or unawakened. You recognize that consciousness is equally present in the mundane and the mystical, in the contracted and the expanded, in the confused and the clear. The goal is not to have only certain kinds of experiences, blissful ones, peaceful ones, profound ones, but to be fully conscious of whatever experience is actually occurring, to bring the light of awareness to everything without preference. And this is where you discover why you can't go back after that moment of true awareness. Because that moment revealed something that can't be unknown. The truth that awareness itself is always pristine, always untouched by the content that appears in it. Your thoughts can't stain awareness. Your emotions can't damage awareness. Your worst mistakes, your darkest moods, your most confused states, none of it actually affects the consciousness that illuminates it all. Just as the movie screen is never harmed by the violence depicted in the film, awareness is never diminished by anything that appears within it. Once you've realized this, genuinely realized it as a living truth rather than just an intellectual concept, the quality of your relationship to experience fundamentally shifts. You're no longer desperately trying to manipulate your inner and outer worlds to create constant comfort and avoid discomfort. You're no longer identified with the voice in your head that's always commenting, judging, comparing, planning. You're no longer fooled by the illusion that your happiness depends on circumstances arranging themselves in a particular way. Instead, you discover a happiness, or perhaps contentment is a better word, that's independent of conditions, that arises from simply being aware, from the recognition of your true nature as the space in which all conditions appear and disappear. This doesn't mean you become passive or indifferent to circumstances. That's a common misunderstanding. People sometimes think that awakening means you stop caring, that you become detached and cold, observing life from some remote mountaintop of pure consciousness. But actually, the opposite is true. When you're no longer desperately clinging to experiences out of a sense of existential need, when you're no longer driven by the unconscious compulsions of the ego trying to prove and protect itself, you're free to engage with life more spontaneously, more authentically, more wholeheartedly. You care deeply about things, but you hold your caring lightly. You love without the suffering that usually accompanies love. You create without attachment to outcomes. You act from inspiration rather than desperation. There's a famous Zen saying, "Before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water." On the surface, this seems to suggest that nothing changes, but everything has changed. It's just that the change is internal, invisible to outside observation. The wood is still being chopped, the water is still being carried, but the quality of consciousness doing the chopping and carrying is completely different. There's no sense of burden, no resentment, no mind wandering to somewhere else. There's just the complete presence with what is, the activity arising spontaneously, without a separate doer claiming credit for it. And once you've tasted this way of being, even if only for a moment, you carry the knowledge of it with you always, even when you forget it, even when you're completely caught up in the drama again, taking your thoughts absolutely seriously and believing your story completely. Even then, there's a deeper current running underneath, a subtle recognition that this too is just another passing state, another weather pattern moving through the sky of consciousness. You can't fully believe in your own bullshit anymore, and that's actually a tremendous gift. This is why many people who've had awakening experiences go through a period of what looks like depression or disillusionment. They've lost their innocence, their naivete about the nature of reality, but they haven't yet fully embodied the freedom that this loss makes possible. They're grieving the death of who they thought they were, mourning the loss of the simple certainties that once organized their lives. Everything that used to motivate them, ambition, achievement, the need for approval, the fear of failure, has been revealed as empty, as a kind of cosmic joke. But they haven't yet discovered what replaces these ego-driven motivations. They're in the gap, the void, and it can feel quite bleak. But if you can sit with this bleakness without trying to escape it, without rushing to reconstruct a new identity or adopt a new set of beliefs, something remarkable happens. The bleakness itself begins to transform. It reveals itself as spaciousness, as openness, as pure potential. What seemed like the death of meaning becomes the birthplace of genuine meaning, not the borrowed, socially constructed meanings that you inherited from your culture, but meaning that arises spontaneously from your authentic engagement with life. You discover that you don't need a grand narrative or a cosmic purpose to justify your existence. Your existence justifies itself simply by being. The universe doesn't need a reason for manifesting as you any more than a flower needs a reason for blooming. There's something deeply paradoxical about the whole situation, something that the rational mind finds extremely frustrating, but which is absolutely central to understanding why you can't return to who you were before that moment of clarity. The paradox is this: the awakening shows you that there is no separate person who could be awakened or unawakened, and yet this very realization seems to happen to someone, seems to transform someone's experience. You've seen through the illusion of the separate self, and yet here you are, still functioning as an apparent individual, still saying I and me, still having preferences and making choices and experiencing the world from this particular point of view. The mind wants to resolve this paradox, to figure out which perspective is correct. Are you a person or not? Is the ego real or illusory? Should you identify as the witness or embrace being human? And as long as you're trying to answer these questions in an either-or fashion, you remain trapped in a dualistic framework that the awakening itself transcends. The truth, if we can even use that word, is that both perspectives are simultaneously valid, and neither is complete on its own. You are both the wave and the ocean, both the character and the screen, both the dream figure and the dreamer. The awakening doesn't eliminate one in favor of the other. It reveals their fundamental non-duality, their mutual interpenetration. But understanding this conceptually and living from it are two entirely different things. You can grasp it intellectually, can even talk about it eloquently, and still be caught in identification with the ego 95% of the time. And this is where most people find themselves after an initial awakening. They have the understanding, they've had the experience, but the embodiment lags behind. The old patterns reassert themselves with impressive regularity. You get angry at traffic, anxious about money, hurt by criticism, proud of accomplishments. All the familiar reactions keep arising, and it's tempting to conclude that nothing has really changed, that the awakening was just a temporary anomaly, a beautiful but ultimately inconsequential blip in your ordinary consciousness. But this conclusion misses what's actually happening. The patterns continue to arise, yes, but your relationship to them has shifted in a subtle but crucial way. Before the awakening, when anger arose, you were the anger. There was complete fusion between awareness and the emotion. The anger filled your entire experiential field, and you acted from it unconsciously, automatically. After the awakening, there's a gap, however slight, between the awareness and the emotion. The anger still arises, it may be just as intense, but there's simultaneously a knowing that the anger is arising, a consciousness that holds the anger without being consumed by it. And in that gap, in that space of recognition, there's freedom. This freedom isn't necessarily freedom from the emotion. You might still feel the full intensity of anger, sadness, fear, whatever arises. The awakening doesn't anesthetize you or place you beyond the reach of human feeling. What it offers is freedom in the emotion, the recognition that you are the space in which the emotion appears, rather than being identical with the emotion itself. And this recognition, once it's been established, is self-reinforcing. Each time you notice this gap, each time you catch yourself being aware of a state rather than lost in it, the witness consciousness becomes a bit more stable, a bit more readily available. This is why it's said that awakening is just the beginning. That initial glimpse reveals the territory, but actually exploring that territory, mapping its contours, learning to navigate it skillfully, that's the work of a lifetime. Or perhaps it's more accurate to say, it's the work of no time at all, because each moment is fresh. Each moment offers the opportunity to wake up to what's already the case. You don't accumulate awakeness the way you accumulate knowledge or skills. You can't get better at being what you already are. But you can become increasingly familiar with recognizing it, increasingly adept at not being distracted from it, increasingly stable in resting as it. And the more this recognition stabilizes, the more it permeates your daily experience, the more obvious it becomes that you could never go back to the old way of being, even if you wanted to, because the old way of being wasn't actually working. It was generating suffering through a fundamental misidentification. You thought you were a small, separate, vulnerable entity that needed to fight for its survival and prove its worth in an indifferent or hostile universe. And from that misidentification flowed all the anxiety, the grasping, the aversion, the endless seeking that never quite found what it was looking for. The awakening shows you that this entire frame was based on a case of mistaken identity, and once you've seen this clearly, you can never quite believe in the story the same way again. It's like watching a magic trick after the magician has explained how it's done. You can still enjoy the performance, still appreciate the skill involved, but you're not fooled by it anymore. You know it's an illusion, and that knowledge changes your relationship to the experience. Similarly, once you've seen through the illusion of the separate self, you can still function as a person, still play the game of being an individual in the world, but you're not fooled by it anymore. You know that beneath the appearance of separation, there's an underlying unity, a seamless wholeness in which all apparent boundaries are provisional and ultimately arbitrary. This knowledge has profound practical implications for how you live. When you're no longer defending a fictitious entity called myself from equally fictitious threats, enormous amounts of energy are freed up. Energy that was previously bound up in worry, self-consciousness, resentment, and fear becomes available for creativity, for love, for genuine engagement with life. You become lighter, more fluid, less rigid in your responses. Things that would have triggered you before, the criticism, the rejection, the failure, lose their power to disturb your peace. Not because you've become hard or indifferent, but because you've seen that they can't actually threaten what you truly are. And paradoxically, as you become less identified with being a separate person, you become more authentically personal. When you're not trying to be someone, not attempting to maintain a particular self-image, you're free to respond spontaneously to each situation without filtering everything through your accumulated beliefs and conditioning. There's a freshness to your interactions, a naturalness that people sense even if they can't articulate what's different about you. You're more you than you've ever been, precisely because you're no longer trying to be you. The self-consciousness that creates stiffness and artificiality drops away, leaving just simple, direct presence. Now, it's important to acknowledge that this process isn't always smooth or pleasant. There can be periods of what's called the dark night of the soul, where the old structures of meaning have dissolved, but new ones haven't yet emerged. You've seen through the ego, but haven't fully stabilized in your true nature, so you're in a kind of no man's land, belonging neither to the conventional world nor to the absolute. This can be disorienting, even frightening. The mind rebels against the groundlessness, tries desperately to reconstruct some solid sense of self, some fixed point of reference, and when it can't, when it keeps confronting the void at the center of what you thought you were, there can be real existential anguish. But this anguish, difficult as it is to endure, is actually a purification process. It's the burning away of the last vestiges of attachment to being someone, to having a fixed identity, to knowing who you are in the conventional sense. And if you can surrender to it, rather than fighting it, if you can let yourself dissolve into the uncertainty without trying to prematurely resolve it, you emerge on the other side with a much deeper stability. Not the stability of a rigid structure, but the stability of water, formless, adaptable, yet unbreakable. You've learned to rest in being rather than in any particular form that being takes. This is when you discover that the inability to return to your previous state isn't a limitation. It's the greatest gift you could receive. You wouldn't want to go back, even if you could. Going back would mean re-entering the prison of self-concern, the constant anxiety of an entity that believes it's fundamentally separate from the rest of existence and must therefore struggle endlessly to maintain itself. It would mean forgetting the peace that comes from knowing yourself as the aware space in which all experience arises and passes. It would mean losing the humor and lightness that come from seeing through the cosmic drama and recognizing it as play rather than as ultimate seriousness. You've been given eyes to see and ears to hear, and having once glimpsed the reality behind the appearances, you can never quite unsee it. Even in your most unconscious moments, even when you're completely caught up in the drama of your life, there's a part of you that knows this is all a magnificent game, all a dream within the mind of consciousness. And this knowledge, once planted, grows of its own accord. You don't have to do anything to cultivate it, except not interfere with its natural unfolding. The seed has been planted, and it will grow in its own time, according to its own nature, until it flowers as the full recognition of what you've always been. Let's consider what happens in the immediate aftermath of an awakening experience, in those first hours and days when you're still reverberating with the power of what you've seen. There's often a sense of urgency, a feeling that you need to share this revelation with everyone, that if people just understood what you now understand, all their suffering would end. You want to shake them awake, to show them that they're searching for something they already have, that they're suffering from a problem that doesn't actually exist. And you're genuinely confused when they don't get it, when your attempts to communicate the ineffable fall flat, when people nod politely but clearly think you've gone a bit strange. This urge to evangelize is understandable, but ultimately misguided, because it comes from a subtle form of the very separation you've supposedly transcended. There's still an I who has gotten something that others don't have, still a division between the awakened and the unawakened. True recognition includes the understanding that consciousness is waking up to itself at its own pace, in its own way, through countless apparently separate beings, and that this process doesn't need your anxious assistance. Your awakening is the universe awakening to itself as you. Their sleep is the universe exploring what it's like to apparently not recognize itself. Both are perfect expressions of the one consciousness at play. As this understanding deepens, the evangelical fervor naturally subsides, replaced by a quieter, more patient presence. You realize that the most effective teaching isn't verbal at all. It's simply being what you are, living from the recognition of your true nature, allowing that recognition to inform your actions without making a performance of it. When you're resting in awareness, when you're not caught in the trance of personhood, there's a quality to your presence that affects others below the level of conscious thought. They may not be able to name what's different about you, but they sense something, feel something that challenges their own sleepwalking without threatening their defenses. And this is important because the defenses are there for a reason. The ego, for all its apparent solidity, is actually quite fragile. It's a construct, a story that consciousness tells itself, and on some level, it knows this. That's why it's so defensive, so reactive to anything that threatens to expose its fictional nature. Direct assault on the ego's fortress rarely works. It just triggers stronger defenses. But a patient, loving presence that doesn't need anything from the other person, that's complete in itself and therefore non-threatening, this can create the conditions in which another's own recognition can spontaneously emerge. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. We're talking about how awakening expresses through you in relation to others, when we haven't fully explored what happens within your own consciousness as the initial experience fades and you're left to integrate its implications. Because this is really where the work is, in the messy middle ground between the peak experience and the stable realization, in the years-long process of learning to live from what you've seen, rather than just having seen it once and then spent the rest of your life talking about it. What you discover in this integration phase is that consciousness has many layers, many levels at which patterns can be held. You might have profound clarity at the level of intellectual understanding. You see clearly that you are not the body-mind, that identification is suffering, that what you are is awareness itself. But at deeper, more somatic levels, the old patterns remain. The body still contracts in fear. The nervous system still activates in response to triggers. The emotional patterns laid down in childhood still run their automatic sequences. And these patterns don't just vanish because you've had a spiritual insight. They need to be met, felt, allowed, integrated at their own level. This is where many people get frustrated with the spiritual path. They've had the big realization, they've seen the truth, and yet here they are, still reactive, still neurotic in many ways, still struggling with the same issues they've always struggled with. And they think something has gone wrong, that they haven't awakened properly, that they need to go back and have the experience again, but more deeply this time. But this is missing the point. The awakening has done its work. It's shifted your fundamental identity from the person to the awareness in which the person appears. But the person, with all its conditioning and patterns, is still present, still requires attention and care and patience. In fact, the awakening often makes you more aware of your patterns rather than less, because now you're actually present to them rather than being unconsciously identified with them. Before, when anger arose, you just were angry. There was no separation between you and the emotion, no space in which to observe it. After awakening, when anger arises, you're aware of it arising, aware of the sensations in the body, aware of the thoughts that accompany it, aware of the whole sequence as it unfolds. This awareness doesn't necessarily prevent the anger. That's a common misconception. But it changes your relationship to it. You're no longer the anger. You're the space in which anger is appearing. And in that space, in that gap of recognition, something interesting can happen. The anger, when it's met with awareness rather than resistance or identification, begins to reveal itself as energy, as sensation, as a passing phenomenon rather than a solid, enduring state. It has a momentum, sure. Emotional patterns have inertia built up over years or decades of repetition. But without the fuel of unconscious identification, without the story-making mind reinforcing it and justifying it, the anger burns through more quickly, leaves less residue. You feel it fully, perhaps more fully than ever before, but you don't become it, and you don't act it out in the unconscious, destructive ways you might have before. This is the beginning of what you might call embodied awakening, where the recognition that occurred in consciousness begins to penetrate into the deeper layers of your being. It's a process that happens over time, that can't be rushed or forced. The body has its own wisdom, its own pace of releasing old patterns. The nervous system needs repeated experiences of safety, of being met with compassionate awareness, before it can begin to relax its vigilant defenses. You can't think your way into this, or will your way through it. You can only show up, over and over, with patient presence, meeting whatever arises with the same awareness that once showed you your true nature. And as this embodiment deepens, as the recognition stabilizes not just as a peak experience, or even as a constant background awareness, but as the very ground from which you live, something remarkable happens. The question of whether you're awake or not awake becomes irrelevant. It's no longer interesting. You're not monitoring yourself, not checking in to see if you're in the right state. You're just here, fully present with what is, responding to life as it unfolds, without the self-conscious overlay of spiritual concern. This is when the teaching really begins to live through you, not as something you do, but as what you are. Your very presence becomes an invitation for others to recognize what they are. Not through preaching or explaining, that might happen sometimes, if the situation calls for it, but through the quality of your being, through the absence of the usual static of ego concern that fills most human interactions. People sense something different, something that reminds them of something they've forgotten, something that calls to the deepest part of them without words. But here's the thing. Even at this stage, you never arrive at some final, permanent state of enlightenment where everything is perfect and you're beyond all human struggle. That's a fantasy, a projection of the ego mind that wants to turn awakening into another achievement, another destination where you can finally rest and say, I've made it. The truth is stranger and more wonderful than that. You discover that awakening is not a state at all. It's the recognition of what's always the case, regardless of what state you're in. You can be enlightened and irritable. You can be awake and confused. You can be self-realized and still make mistakes, still have preferences, still experience the full range of human emotions. The difference is that none of it defines you anymore. None of it sticks to you as an identity. You're the sky, and all these experiences, the pleasant and unpleasant, the clear and confused, the sublime and mundane, are weather passing through. You don't identify as any particular weather pattern. You don't claim the sunny days as proof of your spiritual attainment and deny the stormy days as evidence that you've lost it. You're simply aware of it all, present to it all, allowing it all to be exactly as it is. And this allowance, this radical acceptance of what is perhaps the deepest expression of awakening. Because it's only the ego that resists reality, that wants things to be different than they are, that suffers from the gap between how life is and how it thinks life should be. When you're resting as awareness itself, there's no should. There's just is. Whatever is arising is welcomed, not because you particularly like it or want it, but because it is arising, because resisting what's already the case is futile and exhausting, and the root of all psychological suffering. This doesn't mean you become passive or stop trying to affect change in the world. That's another misconception. Acceptance of what is doesn't prevent action. It enables more effective action, because you're acting from clarity rather than from the contracted energy of resistance. You can see clearly what wants to happen, what the situation is calling for, without your perception being distorted by your personal agenda, your need for things to be a certain way. You're available to life, responsive to it, in a way that you couldn't be when you were busy trying to control everything to match your picture of how it should be. So when we talk about not being able to go back after a moment of true awareness, we're really talking about the impossibility of returning to unconsciousness, to the innocent ignorance of complete identification with the ego story. Even if you try to forget what you've seen, even if you distract yourself with busyness and pleasure-seeking, and all the usual ways humans avoid confronting the truth of their existence, there's a knowing in you now that won't be silenced. It might be quiet sometimes, drowned out by the noise of life, but it's always there, always available, always ready to recognize itself the moment you turn your attention toward it. There's a profound loneliness that can accompany this transformation, a sense of being fundamentally alone in a way you never were before. This isn't the loneliness of social isolation. You might be surrounded by people, engaged in relationships, part of communities. It's a more existential loneliness, the recognition that no one can accompany you into the recognition of what you truly are. It's something each consciousness must discover for itself, in itself, as itself. You can point the way for others, share your own realization, create conditions that might support their awakening, but you can't do it for them. You can't hand them the recognition the way you'd hand them a physical object. And on the flip side, they can't validate your realization for you either. This is crucial to understand. There's a stage in the process where you're looking for confirmation, for someone to tell you that yes, you've got it, you've seen what needs to be seen. But this very seeking of validation reveals that the recognition isn't yet complete, because what you truly are doesn't need validation. Awareness doesn't require anyone's approval or certification. It simply is, whether anyone acknowledges it or not. The need for validation comes from the ego, which is trying to turn the awakening into another accomplishment it can claim, another way of feeling special and superior. When the recognition stabilizes, this need for validation falls away. You're not interested in being seen as enlightened. In fact, there's often a movement in the opposite direction, a preference for anonymity, for ordinariness, for not making yourself special in any way. Because you've seen that specialness is just another form of separation, another way the ego maintains its sense of being distinct and different from everything else. True awakening is the recognition of your absolute ordinariness. You're not special. You're what everything is. The same awareness that looks out through your eyes looks out through everyone's eyes. The same consciousness that animates your body animates all bodies. There's nothing unique about your awareness. It's the one awareness, appearing as many. But this ordinariness is not diminishment. It's actually the most extraordinary thing you could realize, because it means you're not separate from anything. You're intimately connected to all of existence, not through some mystical energy or psychic bond, but through the simple fact that you are existence, looking at itself from this particular angle. When you see a tree, consciousness is seeing itself as tree. When you encounter another person, consciousness is meeting itself in disguise. When you feel the wind on your skin, the universe is feeling itself. Every experience is consciousness exploring its own potential, its own creativity, its infinite capacity to appear as apparently separate phenomena. Once this is seen, really seen, reality becomes alive in a way it never was before. The deadness that characterized the materialist worldview, the sense that you're just a biological robot in a mechanical universe that's fundamentally indifferent to your existence, completely dissolves. Because you realize that matter itself is not dead. That form is not separate from consciousness. That the physical world is not the opposite of spirit, but its expression, its manifestation, its playful display. The body you thought was a prison trapping your soul is actually consciousness making itself tangible. The world you thought was external and objective is actually consciousness objectifying itself, creating the appearance of otherness so it can experience itself from infinite perspectives. And this recognition doesn't just change how you think about reality, it changes how you experience reality. Colors become more vivid, not because your eyes have changed, but because you're no longer filtering perception through the deadening lens of conceptual thought. Sensations become more immediate, more alive, because you're no longer lost in mental narrative about what's being sensed. Relationships become more intimate, more genuine, because you're no longer interacting with your mental representations of people, but with the actual living presence that they are. Life becomes fresh, moment by moment, because you're no longer approaching it with the assumption that you know what anything is. This freshness, this not knowing, is one of the hallmarks of awakened consciousness. The mind loves to know, loves to categorize and label and explain everything. It creates a sense of security through the illusion of understanding. But true understanding is not mental. It's the recognition that arises in direct experience, prior to thought. When you're present to a tree without the word tree, without all your botanical knowledge and memories of other trees and associations with treeness, when you're just open to the actual presence of this particular manifestation of life energy, something miraculous happens. You're meeting reality directly, intimately, without the buffer of conceptual knowledge standing between you and what is. And in this direct meeting, you discover something that no amount of thinking could reveal: the inherent completeness of this moment. Just this, just here, just now. Not as a stepping stone to somewhere else, not as a means to some future end, but as an end in itself, perfect in its very existence. The mind can't grasp this because the mind lives in time, always comparing this moment to past moments and future possibilities, always evaluating and judging and trying to improve things. But awareness itself is timeless. It's always now, eternally present, and in that presence, nothing is lacking. This is perhaps the most radical aspect of awakening, and the hardest for the conceptual mind to accept: the recognition that nothing needs to be different than it is for you to be complete. Not that things can't or shouldn't change. Change is the nature of existence, the constant flow of forms arising and dissolving. But your essential nature, your being, is not enhanced or diminished by any of these changes. You're complete whether you're successful or unsuccessful, healthy or sick, praised or blamed, comfortable or uncomfortable. The wholeness you are is not conditional on circumstances. And when this is genuinely realized, not just as an idea but as a lived truth, the desperate quality drops out of life. You're no longer chasing anything, because there's nowhere to get to that's more here than here. You're no longer running from anything, because there's nothing that can threaten what you truly are. This doesn't mean you stop having preferences or cease making efforts to improve your life situation. But the efforts are no longer driven by a sense of lack, by the belief that you'll be okay only when you achieve certain goals. You're already okay, fundamentally okay, and the activities of life arise naturally from that okayness rather than from desperate grasping. This is what it means to live in the world but not be of it, to play the game fully while knowing it's a game. You engage completely with whatever you're doing, working, creating, relating, resting, but you're not fooled into thinking that any of it is ultimately serious. It's all the play of consciousness, the cosmic dance, and you're dancing along, playing your part, but with a lightness, a humor, an ease that comes from knowing that nothing is ever really at stake. The separate person you appear to be is not ultimately real, so it can't ultimately be harmed. And what you truly are, the awareness in which all experience arises, has never been born and will never die, can never be damaged or destroyed. Now this might sound abstract or philosophical, but it has immediate practical implications. When you're not defending a fictional entity, when you're not worried about the survival and enhancement of a separate self, you become incredibly free in your interactions with life. You can afford to be honest, to be vulnerable, to take risks, to fail, to look foolish, because none of it threatens your being. You can love without clinging, because you're not dependent on the other person to complete you. You can create without attachment, because your worth is not tied to the outcome of your creations. You can give without keeping score, because you're not operating from a sense of scarcity. This freedom naturally expresses as compassion, though not the sentimental kind that pities others or feels sorry for them. It's a deeper compassion that recognizes the suffering inherent in identification with the separate self, that sees others struggling with the same fundamental confusion you once struggled with, or perhaps still do, in moments of unconsciousness. And this recognition naturally gives rise to a desire to alleviate suffering, not from a sense of should or moral obligation, but from the simple fact that there's no real boundary between you and them. Their suffering is your suffering. Their liberation is your liberation, because at the deepest level, there's only one consciousness experiencing itself through countless apparent forms. So you find yourself acting in ways that serve the larger whole, not because you're trying to be spiritual or good, but because that's what naturally happens when the illusion of separation thins. You're less concerned with your personal advantage and more attuned to the flow of life itself, to what wants to happen through this particular body-mind. You become an instrument of consciousness, playing your unique note in the cosmic symphony, contributing your particular flavor to the infinite creativity of existence expressing itself. And yet, and this is important, you remain completely human. You don't transcend your humanity, you fulfill it. You're not trying to be some ideal of perfection, not attempting to eliminate all your quirks and preferences and limitations. You're being fully what you are, including all the so-called flaws and imperfections, but without the suffering that comes from thinking these should be different. You embrace your humanity completely while simultaneously recognizing that your humanity is not what you ultimately are. You're the awareness in which this human experience is arising, and that awareness is okay with whatever form it's taking in this moment. This is perhaps the deepest meaning of not being able to go back. You can never again believe that the solution to life's challenges lies in becoming someone different, someone better, someone more evolved or enlightened. You've seen that what you are is already complete, and that any sense of incompleteness comes from identification with what you are not, with the body, the mind, the personality, the story. And once you've seen this, the whole project of self-improvement reveals itself as a kind of innocent confusion, the ego trying to fix a problem that doesn't actually exist. Let's explore more deeply this question of embodiment, because it's here that many people stumble, here that the gap between understanding and living can seem impossibly wide. You've had the insight, you know intellectually and even experientially that you are not the body-mind, that you are the awareness in which the body-mind appears, and yet the body-mind continues to have its reactions, its pains, its desires, its fears. The old conditioning keeps running its programs. You find yourself getting irritated by small things, anxious about the future, caught in familiar patterns of relationship dysfunction. And you wonder, if I've really awakened, why am I still so human, still so messy, still so obviously not enlightened in my actual behavior? This is where a lot of confusion arises, because there are different models of enlightenment floating around in spiritual culture, and they don't all agree. Some traditions emphasize the sudden, complete awakening, where all conditioning is instantly burned away, and you become a perfected being, forever untouched by worldly concerns. Others acknowledge a gradual ripening process, where the initial awakening is just the beginning of a long journey of integration and purification. The truth, as lived by actual human beings going through this process, seems to support the latter model more than the former. What you discover is that awakening happens in layers, or perhaps it's more accurate to say that consciousness has different levels at which it can be awake or asleep. You might be awake at the level of recognition. You see clearly that you are awareness, not a person, and yet still be asleep at the level of emotional reactivity, still be caught in unconscious patterns when triggered. You might be awake in meditation, resting as pure presence, and yet get completely lost in your head when faced with a challenging conversation. You might be awake in the silence of retreat and asleep in the chaos of daily life. This isn't a problem to be solved. It's the nature of the integration process. The initial awakening happens in consciousness, in the most refined, subtle level of your being. But you're not just consciousness. You're consciousness that has taken form as a body, with a nervous system, with a brain that's been wired through decades of experience, with emotional patterns laid down in childhood, with cellular memories and ancestral conditioning. And all of this doesn't just evaporate because you've had an awakening. It remains, and it needs to be met, felt, seen, allowed, integrated. The good news is that the awakening itself provides the means for this integration, because now you have access to a quality of awareness that can hold all of this conditioning without being overwhelmed by it. You can feel the fear fully without becoming the fear. You can watch the old patterns run without identifying as the pattern. You can let the emotions move through you, sometimes intensely, sometimes painfully, while remaining as the space in which they're moving. And as you do this, again and again, the patterns gradually lose their charge, their compulsive quality. They're still there, but they're lighter, less dense, less believable. This process requires patience, which is often in short supply after an awakening. The mind wants results, wants to arrive, wants to be done with all this messy human stuff, and just rest in pure awareness forever. But that's the ego in disguise, trying to use awakening to escape from life, rather than to engage with it more fully. The real work is not to transcend your humanity, but to bring consciousness into your humanity, to illuminate it with awareness, to let the light of recognition penetrate into every dark corner of your being. And this is actually where the real transformation happens, not in the peak experiences or the profound insights, but in the ordinary moments when you catch yourself being reactive, and instead of judging yourself or trying to suppress the reaction, you simply observe it with compassionate awareness. In that observation, in that simple meeting of what is with acceptance rather than resistance, the pattern begins to untangle. Not through force, not through effort, but through the magic of consciousness becoming aware of itself in its contracted forms. Think of it this way. Conditioning is like a knot in the fabric of consciousness. The knot exists only because consciousness has temporarily forgotten its nature, has identified with a limited perspective, and held that identity tightly, creating a fixed pattern of energy. When consciousness recognizes itself again, when awareness shines on the knot, the tight holding begins to loosen. Not all at once usually, but gradually, naturally, as the intelligence inherent in consciousness begins to restore the natural flow. You don't have to figure out how to untie the knot. You don't have to understand where it came from or why it formed. You just have to be willing to feel it, to be present with it, to allow it to be there without trying to make it go away. And in that allowing, something mysterious happens. The knot begins to untie itself. The energy that was bound up in maintaining the pattern becomes available again. The contraction releases, and consciousness flows more freely through that area of your being. This is why the awakening changes everything, even though on the surface, everything might look much the same. You're still the same person, with the same personality, the same history, the same habits. But the relationship to all of it has fundamentally shifted. You're no longer fighting with yourself, no longer at war with your humanity, no longer trying to be something other than what you are. And in that relaxation of the inner conflict, natural healing begins to occur. It's not that you become perfect. Perfect is a concept, an ideal, a fantasy of the mind. You become real. You become authentic. You become present. And in that presence, even your imperfections, your weaknesses, your failures, they're all held in the vast embrace of acceptance. They're no longer problems that disqualify you from awakening. They're simply the particular ways that consciousness has chosen to limit itself in order to have this experience of being you. And there's a beauty in that, a poignancy, a recognition that this limited, flawed, struggling human life is itself the expression of the infinite playing in the realm of the finite. So when we talk about not being able to go back, part of what we're referring to is this shift from war to peace, from resistance to acceptance, from the effort to fix yourself to the allowing of yourself to be as you are. Once you've tasted the relief of self-acceptance, once you've experienced the freedom that comes from no longer needing to be different, you can't willingly return to the exhausting project of self-improvement. Oh, you might slip back into it sometimes. Old habits die hard. But you catch yourself more quickly now. You recognize the familiar tightness of trying to be something other than what is, and you remember, there's another way. You can just be here, just this, without needing anything to change. And paradoxically, when you stop trying to change, when you stop resisting what is, that's often when real change begins to happen. Not the forced change of the willful ego, but the organic transformation that occurs when consciousness is no longer divided against itself. The Buddha called this effortless effort. The Taoists called it Wu Wei, action through non-action. It's the art of allowing life to live through you rather than trying to control life from the position of a separate self. You become like water, not because you're trying to be like water, not because you've read somewhere that water is spiritual, but because that's what naturally happens when you stop being rigid, stop holding fixed positions, stop insisting that life conform to your expectations. You flow around obstacles rather than battering against them. You take the shape of whatever container you're in without losing your essential nature. You're soft yet powerful, yielding yet persistent, humble yet capable of wearing away stone. This is the maturity of awakening, when the recognition stops being something special that happened to you and becomes the very ground of your existence. You're not thinking about it, not monitoring it, not concerned with whether you're awake or asleep. You're just here, living this life, responding to what arises, dancing with existence in all its infinite creativity and chaos. And the question of going back doesn't even occur to you anymore, because there's nowhere to go back to. The past is gone, the person you were is gone, and what remains is this, just this, ever fresh, ever new, ever present. The old life, the life of unconscious identification, is like a dream you once had. You can remember it, can recall the sense of what it was like to believe you were the dreamer rather than the dreaming, but you can't re-enter it with the same naive conviction. The lucidity has been achieved, and even though you might sometimes forget and get absorbed in the dream again, there's always this background knowing that reminds you, this is appearance, this is play, this is consciousness exploring what it's like to be apparently limited. And in that remembering, in that return to lucidity, there's a joy that doesn't depend on circumstances, a peace that transcends understanding, a love that includes everything without exception. Not because you're trying to be joyful or peaceful or loving. Those would be qualities of the person, and the person is just another appearance in awareness. But because joy and peace and love are the natural qualities of consciousness itself, always present, though often obscured by the turbulence of identification with thought and emotion. There's another dimension to this irreversibility that we haven't fully explored yet, the way your relationship to death transforms once you've recognized what you truly are. Before awakening, death is the ultimate threat, the final enemy, the end of everything you know and hold dear. Your entire life is organized, consciously or unconsciously, around avoiding this inevitable event, postponing it as long as possible, not thinking about it, distracting yourself from its reality. And this death denial shapes everything. Your choices, your fears, your attachments, your desperate grasping at pleasure and security. But when you've seen that what you truly are was never born, the whole existential terror around death begins to dissolve. Not because you've adopted some belief system that promises an afterlife or reincarnation, though such beliefs might arise and they're fine, but because you've recognized directly that consciousness itself is not subject to birth and death. Forms appear and disappear in consciousness. The body is born and will die. The personality, with all its memories and characteristics, emerges and will dissolve. But the awareness in which all of this arises, the consciousness that knows the body and the person, has no beginning and no end. It simply is. This recognition doesn't make you cavalier about death or indifferent to the death of the body. The survival instinct remains, and there's usually still a preference for continued existence in this form. But the absolute terror is gone, replaced by something closer to curiosity or acceptance. Death becomes fascinating rather than terrifying, the ultimate unknown, the dissolution of everything familiar, the return of the wave to the ocean. You might still have fear arise when confronted with death. Fear is a bodily response, and the body has its own intelligence, but you're not identified with that fear. You're the awareness that notices fear arising, and that awareness is untouchable, unharmed, eternally free. And this shift in your relationship to death reverberates through everything. When you're no longer running from death, when you've relaxed the desperate clinging to life, you become more available to actually live. The precious present moment, which you were always too busy to notice because you were preoccupied with securing the future, suddenly reveals itself as the only moment there is, the only place life is actually happening. You find yourself drinking more deeply from the cup of experience, tasting each moment more fully, because you're not holding back, not saving yourself for some imagined future when it will be safe to fully be here. This is what Zen practitioners mean when they talk about dying before you die. It's not physical death they're referring to, but the death of identification, the death of the ego's claim to be what you are. And when that dies, when you see through it, when you recognize it as the fiction it is, what remains is life itself, pure and unfiltered, not mediated through the fearful, grasping perspective of a separate self. You're alive in a way you never were before, precisely because you're no longer trying to preserve and protect a life that was always just a concept anyway. And from this deeper life, this uncontrived aliveness, actions arise that have a different quality. They're not motivated by fear or lack. They're not attempts to fill some inner emptiness or prove your worth. They're spontaneous expressions of consciousness playing, creating, loving, exploring. You might still work, still pursue goals, still care about outcomes, but the desperation is gone. You're playing for the joy of playing rather than for some existential payoff. This shift is subtle but profound. Other people sense it, even if they can't name what's different. There's an ease about you, a lack of the usual human striviness, a quality of being comfortable in your own skin. You're not trying to impress anyone or defend yourself from judgment. You're not scanning the environment for threats or opportunities. You're just present, relaxed, available. And that presence is magnetic, precisely because it's so rare. Most people are not present. They're lost in thought, worried about the future, rehearsing the past, planning their next move, evaluating everything in terms of how it affects them. But you've dropped out of that self-referential loop, or at least you're not caught in it constantly. And when you meet someone from that place of presence, they feel met in a way they rarely experience. You're actually there with them, not filtered through your own agenda and self-concern. You're listening to what they're actually saying, rather than formulating your response while they're talking. You're seeing them as consciousness appears as them, rather than as an object in your world to be used or avoided. And this quality of presence, of genuine meeting, is healing. People don't always know why they feel better after being around you, why they feel less defended, less burdened. But it's because consciousness recognizes itself, even unconsciously. When they're in the presence of someone who's resting as awareness, it reminds them of their own true nature, even if that reminder doesn't make it to conscious recognition. It's like a tuning fork. When one starts vibrating at a certain frequency, nearby tuning forks begin to resonate in sympathy. Your presence invites their presence, calls them home to themselves without a word being spoken. Now, this isn't about becoming a better person or a more effective spiritual teacher. That would be the ego co-opting the awakening again, turning it into another achievement. This is simply what naturally happens when consciousness is no longer contracted around a separate self. Love flows more freely. Compassion arises spontaneously. Generosity becomes natural. Not because you're trying to be loving or compassionate or generous, but because these are the inherent qualities of consciousness itself, no longer blocked by the narrow focus of self-interest. And here's another way you can't go back. Once you've tasted the sweetness of living from love rather than from fear, once you've experienced the freedom of acting from wholeness rather than from lack, you can't willingly return to the constricted life of ego-driven existence. Even when you fall back into old patterns, and you will, repeatedly, there's a knowing that this isn't satisfying anymore, that the pleasures of the ego are thin and temporary compared to the deep fulfillment of simply being what you are. The ego's projects no longer captivate you the way they once did. The promises it makes, that you'll be happy when you achieve this goal, when you acquire that possession, when you win this person's approval, you've seen through these promises. You know they're empty, that no amount of external success can fill the void that the ego experiences, because the void is itself the product of the ego's fundamental misidentification. You are not lacking anything. You never were. The sense of lack was created by believing yourself to be a separate fragment rather than the whole. So the motivational structure that organized your life begins to shift. You're less driven, less ambitious in the conventional sense, but you're not lazy or unmotivated. That's a common misunderstanding. You're simply motivated by different things. Instead of the fear-based motivations of the ego, the need to prove yourself, to secure yourself, to make yourself special, you find yourself moved by what genuinely calls to you, by what life seems to want to express through this particular body-mind. You're in service to something larger than your personal agenda, though you might not think of it in those terms. There's a sense of vocation that emerges, not as a grand calling necessarily, but as a natural alignment with your true nature. You do what you do because that's what wants to be done, because that's what flows naturally from who you are, not because you're trying to get somewhere or become someone. The doing and the being are no longer separate. You're not working towards some future reward. You're expressing what is, right now, in whatever form that takes. This is perhaps the most practical aspect of awakening. It simplifies everything. When you're no longer trying to maintain a particular self-image, when you're not concerned with winning and losing in the game of life, when you're not comparing yourself to others or measuring your worth by external standards, life becomes remarkably straightforward. You do what's in front of you. You respond to what arises. You're honest because there's no reason to be otherwise. You're kind because harshness serves no purpose. You're clear because obfuscation is unnecessary. The complexities and complications that characterize most people's lives, the dramas, the conflicts, the tortured relationships, the elaborate machinations to get what they want while avoiding what they don't want, these begin to fall away, not through any deliberate simplification, but through natural attrition. When you're not adding extra meaning to everything, when you're not making everything about you and your survival, life itself is actually quite simple. Challenging at times, yes. Painful sometimes, certainly. But not complicated in the way the unawakened mind makes it complicated.